All right, welcome. Today we are jumping into a really fascinating and, let's be honest, pretty controversial theory from our source material. It's an idea that really makes you question the nature of the money that's sitting in your wallet right now. And it all starts with one simple question. What if that cash you use every single day is just one of two completely different, legally distinct types of currency here in the United States? The material we're digging into today argues that there's a second kind of money, something called lawful money, and it has totally different rules, especially when you get to taxes. To really understand this, we've got to go back in time. According to the analysis in our source, 1913 is the year. It's the moment everything changed. Before this, the source points out, there wasn't a widespread federal income tax. But in this one single year, two huge pieces of legislation got passed that, according to this theory, built a brand new financial system for America.
Now, what's really wild when you look at this is the timing. First, you get the Federal Reserve Act, which created the Federal Reserve, and the source describes it not as a government agency, but as a private entity. Then, almost at the exact same moment, the Revenue Act comes along and establishes the modern income tax and what would eventually become the IRS. The source we're looking at says, hey, that's no coincidence.
So this is the absolute core of the theory, the link between these two organizations. The argument is that every single Federal Reserve note is basically an IOU, a debt issued to the government that has to be paid back with interest. And so, the IRS, created in the same year, is basically the collection agency. Its job is to collect the income tax needed to pay the interest on that debt.
And to show what the source claims is the long-term result of the system, take a look at this number. The argument is that constantly creating money based on debt leads to inflation, and it points to this statistic, a 96% loss in the dollar's buying power since 1913. Basically, what a dollar could get you back then costs way, way more today.
You know, it all seems incredibly complex, right?
Well, the source brings up this quote from economist John Kenneth Galbraith to suggest that maybe that's the point. The theory is that the complexity isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's there to hide how the system really works. But the source claims there's a legal way around all this, hidden in plain sight.
Okay, so now the story jumps ahead to 1933, the height of the Great Depression. And this is where the theory takes a really sharp turn. We shift from how the system was created to what the source calls a permanent legal way out. And it all started when America said goodbye to the gold standard.
So, right in the middle of the Great Depression, President Roosevelt's administration made a really dramatic move. It ordered American citizens to trade in all their gold for paper currency, for Federal Reserve notes that were no longer backed by gold. As you can imagine, this was a hugely controversial decision.
In fact, the source highlights this one congressman, Lewis Thomas McFadden, who actually stood up on the floor of Congress and called it theft and treason. I mean, wow. He argued the government can't just take people's gold and give them paper that's not backed by anything. And this created a huge legal problem for Congress.
So, to get out of this legal mess and protect itself from being sued, Congress, according to this theory, quickly passed a resolution. And buried inside that resolution was a legal remedy, a special clause that was meant to be permanent to make sure citizens always had a legal path to get something other than this new currency.
And here it is. This is the linchpin of the entire theory, Title 12, Section 411 of the U.S. Code. According to the source's interpretation, the most important words are, shall be redeemed in lawful money. Now, in legal language, shall isn't a suggestion, it's a command. The theory says that this term, lawful money, is specifically referring to a totally different kind of currency, United States notes, which are issued directly by Congress, not by the Fed.
So this one law is basically presented as the legal basis for a two-currency system. On one hand, you have the Federal Reserve note, what the source calls debt money, and on the other, you have the United States note, or lawful money. So let's actually break down what the differences are supposed to be. This table really lays it all out. So first row, who issues it? You've got the Fed, a private entity, versus the U.S. Congress, directly. Then, what's it based on? Well, a Federal Reserve note is a debt obligation, while a U.S. note is a direct, debt-free issue. And that brings us to the real kicker, the third row, tax liability. The whole theory is that income tax exists to service the debt on the Fed's notes. So if you're not using those notes, well, you can see where this argument is headed.
Okay, so the million-dollar question. If this other currency actually exists, how in the world do you choose it? Well, the source explains that the whole strategy depends on this legal concept called presumption, and more importantly, how you go about breaking it.
So a legal presumption is basically the system's default setting. It's something that's just assumed to be true unless you actively prove otherwise.
The argument here is that our whole banking system is running on a default setting. It just presumes that everybody is using Federal Reserve notes. So the key, according to this theory, is to actively, formally, and legally state otherwise.
The source material has this fantastic analogy to explain it. Imagine a baby elephant that gets tied to a small stake in the ground. It tries to get away, but it can't, so eventually it just gives up. Now, fast forward a few years. The elephant is massive. It could pull that stake out of the ground without even trying, but it never does because it still believes it's tied down. That little stake? That's the legal presumption.
So how do you uproot the stake? The method described is all about creating a very clear, very specific paper trail for every single dollar you earn. So for a physical check, it says you endorse it with specific legal language, citing that law 12 U.S.C. 411. For your direct deposit, it suggests making a new form with the same kind of language for the Treasury. And you do this for all other income sources too, to formally put it on the record that you're demanding lawful money.
And that brings us to the final part of all this, the consequences. What does the source say actually happens when you take these steps? After creating this paper trail all year long, how does it all shake out with your money and, most importantly, with your taxes?
Okay, so according to this theory, here's how it plays out on your 1040 tax form. You report your total income, just like normal. But then, you take a deduction for the full amount that you redeemed into lawful money throughout the year. The final result is that your adjusted gross income, your AGI, which is the number that your tax is actually calculated on, ends up being very low, or even zero.
Now this is a really important point. The source is very, very clear about the limits here. This whole process is claimed to apply only to federal income tax. It would not affect your Social Security, your Medicare, property taxes, sales taxes, gas taxes, any other kind of tax. The source claims that those taxes are what actually fund government operations.
The source is also really upfront about a pretty big drawback. If you have a low or zero AGI on your tax returns, it's going to be incredibly hard to qualify for things like a mortgage or a car loan, because banks look at that number to figure out if you're a good risk.
So, at the end of the day, what do we do with a theory like this? Is it some kind of forgotten legal right, a pathway that's been hiding in banking law for almost a century? Or is it a creative but ultimately incorrect reading of a really complex law? Now, the source material presents its case, but it is critical to note that so-called tax protester arguments like these have been consistently and repeatedly rejected by U.S. courts. Ultimately, the source argues the choice to look into it further, and the responsibility for that choice is up to you.